Hey folks, trying to do today's lesson real quick. Today we're going to be talking about Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson and his famous Valley Campaign. Here's his picture. We talked about Stonewall a little bit when we did the Battle of First Manassas, how he got his nickname that his troops were standing like a stone wall. There he is in all his glory. Really famous guy, especially if you're from Virginia, and really entirely because of the Shenandoah Campaign, because he was killed not terribly long after that. He fought another year in the war, but the Shenandoah Valley Campaign is his masterpiece. So a little bit of background on this guy. He was the son of a lawyer. Uh, he was born in present-day West Virginia and grew up there. Um, his dad, though, died relatively early in his life, and so he was orphaned and raised by his uncles who were both bachelors. So he was sort of raised, handed off from one to the other. He had a brother who he was also with growing up. He was raised very religious, so he was a very he sort of rebelled against religion early in his life, but he became religious later in his life due to his sort of hypochondria and a maybe imaginary stomach illness that he continued to foster his entire life. More on that later. So he was raised by his uncles in West Virginia. They were very hard on him. Like I said, they were very religious. He ended up running away from his uncles, and he actually spent some time sort of Tom Sawyering down the Mississippi. He was floating on a raft down the Mississippi with his brother. He ended up coming home from that very ill, and later in his life, he refused to talk about it. So nobody really knows what he did while he was on the river or what went on with that. But that's kind of interesting. It's very nice to look at this guy and his upbringing, contrast him with, say, McClellan, who we spent a lot of time looking at last time, and see how very, very different, wildly different their backgrounds are. Um, anyway, like I said, he was a hypochondriac. After his illness, after floating the Mississippi, he always thought he was sick, and he had this constant stomach problems and indigestion and feeling nauseated, but doctors could never identify what it was, and some of them accused him of making it up. But he became very convinced that diet was the secret to overcoming stomach illness, and he tried all kinds of different diets and eating regimens throughout the rest of his life. Ultimately, pretty much slowly eliminating various things from his food intake, uh, which I don't know. I think that's kind of interesting. Uh, in any case, he got into West Point because a congressman owed his dead father a favor, and the congressman followed through and wrote a recommendation of Thomas Jackson to West Point, and he was accepted. He almost flunked out his first semester because when he got there, he was at like a sixth grade reading and writing level, and he had never really been taught. He wasn't illiterate, but he wasn't the same caliber and quality as other people going into the institution, people like McClellan. And so he was pretty much bottom of his class, dead last in his class the first year. He worked really hard. He ended up not sleeping very much and constantly working to improve himself and improve his skills. Hey, a guy who improves his writing skills by trying. I love that. And by the end of his time at West Point, he had gotten himself up into the top third of the class, which says something when you think that he was dead last his first year. Think how much he had to improve, and how by the end of the time there, he probably had the best final year of anybody in the school in his grade. He left West Point, and just like so many people that you've seen so far, he went to the Mexican War, where he fought well. He was actually promoted a number of times and left that engagement as a major. There he is in his United States military uniform. This picture is taken around the time of the Mexican War. And here's a little Mexican War photo for you. You can sort of, guy on the horse has like the same sideburns. Is it him? I'm not saying it's him, but you know, whoever painted this picture, it made that guy on the horse look a lot like Jackson. Anyway, after he left the war, he ended up leaving the military to become a professor of tactics at the Virginia Military Institute, VMI. Still operating today, a really famous private military school. And so he was an expert on the Napoleonic Wars and on Julius Caesar and taught classes. Apparently he was a super boring teacher. Kids hated his lectures. They thought, he put them to sleep and all this kind of stuff. Also, he was super duper into the rule book. When he got there, there's a famous story about how he memorized the rule book and all the various transgressions that students could make, and he never tired of giving students demerits or hitting them with reprimands because they weren't following the rule book to the letter. And so he was both feared and very boring. And apparently, he really enjoyed his life at VMI, though he had a very structured life. He got married to a preacher's daughter. I forgot to mention he found religion. Like I said, he grew up in a very religious household and sort of rebelled against religion and didn't really believe it. But he was down with a horrible bout of his stomach illness that he couldn't recover from, and then he felt the presence of the Lord and made a miraculous recovery and was sure that God had helped him recover from his illness. And then he became very, very stringent in his behaviors. Didn't drink, didn't do anything, that he thought was wrong. Because as he said, all right, maybe it's, you're not going to get kicked out of heaven for drinking, but why risk it? That was sort of his attitude. So when the war started, he was reinstated in the Confederate military as a colonel. So he went from major to colonel, the next rank up. And his first assignment was to garrison Harpers Ferry, which, if you recall, is a military installation, an armory that the North, a United States armory that had recently been taken over by the Confederacy. And so Jackson went up there, and when he got there were all these militia generals and all these people in fancy clothes who arrived and were trying to be in charge of him, but he was in the true Confederate military, and so he kicked them all out and took over and set up a defense. Ultimately, he realized the place was indefensible. He was promoted to brigadier general, and he retreated his troops back across the Potomac River to Winchester, and that's where he and his army were stationed. So we talked about him at First Manassas and how he ended up, fighting really well and earning a promotion to a major general. But, brigadier general, major general, there's all these weird terms for various ranks, and I figure it's probably easiest just to go through that now so you get a sense. You don't have to memorize this list or anything, but I think it's important that you know it. So the following I just copied and pasted from the Smithsonian, and I'll link it in the classroom if you want to look at it in more detail. But a Civil War military unit was composed of various layers and various levels of troops, and they each had their own commanders. So a company is the basic unit in the Civil War Army. It's about 100 men, and there's a captain for every 100 men. So a captain is in charge of 100 men. So if you hear somebody referred to as a captain, think about them controlling 100 guys. I think it's interesting that the highest rank that McClellan achieved before he suddenly became the general of the entire Union Army was captain. So he went from controlling 100 men to 100,000. Think about that. Then we have a regiment. A regiment is 10 companies. So if a company is 100 men, a regiment is 1,000 men. And the regimental commander is a colonel. So Jackson is a colonel at the outset of the Civil War. If the unit had 4 to 8 companies, it was called a battalion rather than a regiment. So if it had 400 or between 400 and 800 men, they didn't call it a regiment because it wasn't a full strength regiment. So a battalion is usually a regiment that's lost some men in combat. And that's, if you hear that distinction, it might be worth your while. Brigade contained an average of 4 regiments. A brigade had approximately 4,000 men and was commanded by a brigadier general. So when you hear that Jackson became a brigadier general, he's now in charge of his own brigade. He actually had a brigade of soldiers he called the Stonewall Brigade, and they were famous throughout the war. We'll talk about them a little bit later, but they were the brigade that he fought with at First Manassas, because at First Manassas he was a brigadier general. Then we get to a division, which is composed of 5 brigades. And so a division generally has about 12,000 men, and it's commanded by a major general, and that's what he was promoted to after First Manassas. Footnote, Confederate divisions tended to be bigger than Union divisions. There were fewer of them, and so he has 17,000 men in the Shenandoah Campaign, and that's a division. That's his division. Corps were combined of divisions, somewhere between 3 and 5 divisions generally formed a corps. You'll remember that there were 4 corps in McClellan's army, and an army is composed of 1 to 8 corps. So you can sort of look at that and get a sense, I think, of what's going on. So anyway, as I said, Jackson ended up retreating to Winchester, and he was a brigadier general, and he had the Stonewall Brigade, so named after 1st Manassas. He liked to refer to them also as his foot cavalry, because he stressed discipline and he marched his men tirelessly, and they got to the point where they could cover an enormous distance, far more than any other infantry unit in the war. And so he stressed mobility. He learned that from Julius Caesar. One of the great things the Roman army, especially Julius Caesar's army, had that the enemies did not have was mobility. And if you could get somewhere faster, you could find the better ground. You could choose where the battle was. You could control all this stuff. And so he ended up having soldiers at one time during the Shenandoah Valley campaign march 650 miles in 48 days with very little rest in between. So his guys could march fast and long and not be tired in the same way that other regiments got tired. Now, part of this is because Jackson was, I don't want to say uniquely, he was unsympathetic. Let's put it that way. If you got sick, you weren't a good soldier. If you got injured, you weren't a good soldier. You lost your usefulness to him. And so he had no qualms about leaving sick or injured men behind. And he didn't listen to it when his soldiers grumbled. He just continued on. And he didn't march. He rode a horse. So I guess, his horse is kind of a famous little horse. So he apparently bought this gelding horse for his wife, and then he took a shine to it. And it was this little horse, and he was a tall man. He was like 6 feet. And so when he rode his horse, his feet were almost dragging on the ground. But the horse was tireless, just like him. It never got tired. It never gave up. And so he rode it throughout the war. Anyway, let's talk about the Shenandoah Valley campaign. That's what we're here for. Here's a map that maybe will help you see what's going on. Let me move myself into some inconspicuous. There we go. So you can sort of see the Peninsula Campaign. That's where McClellan's huge army is advancing towards Richmond. You can see Richmond on the map. You see D.C. on the map. The Shenandoah Valley is, and I don't have a mouse that I can point and show you, but it's that valley between the mountain ranges there on the left-hand side. And as you can see, it's sort of the back door to Virginia. It was also the breadbasket of Virginia. It's where a lot of the crops were grown. The tidewater soil is all clay and not particularly great for crop yields. Like wheat and things like that. And so a lot of and it was also being used for cotton and tobacco and the kinds of cash crops that the South was known for on its plantations. So a lot of the farming was actually done in the Shenandoah Valley that produced food. And so it was important in that way, but it's also sort of the back door to Virginia. If a Union army can march down that valley, they can cross at any one of the passes through the mountains, and they can come in behind Virginia armies that were trying to hold off the armies from D.C. And so you can see tactically why it's an important location as well. Also, the Shenandoah Valley was a threat to Washington, D.C. If, say, McClellan's army was all the way down there on the peninsula and D.C. didn't have enough of a defense, an army from the Shenandoah Valley could march up and come around from the north and get D.C. from behind. And so there were a lot of concerns about the Shenandoah Valley from both sides. So let me put myself back in my corner. The Shenandoah Campaign is famous because Jackson had a grand total of 17,000 men. And the Union, in contrast, had 52,000 men, which is an enormous outnumbering of the Confederate forces. And yet, Jackson fought a series of battles, and he won those battles, and ultimately caused twice as many casualties to the Union as he himself sustained over the course of the campaign, which is amazing when you think about it. Here's sort of an image of the campaign itself and where the battles were fought and the various forces. This image is way bigger than I anticipated, but we'll deal with it. And I sent you some videos to look at, and hopefully you had a chance to look at them. But Jackson's main methodology in his campaign that allowed him to be successful is, first off, he stressed speed and maneuverability. He was able to move his troops faster than his enemies could move their troops, and so he was able to marshal his forces better. Secondly, he had very good scouting abilities. He knew the territory, he knew the land. He's from West Virginia himself, and he spent some time in the Shenandoah Valley. But he also had scouts. He had competent cavalry that he was using as a scouting force, and they were able to tell him about the movements of his enemies. And so he had good intelligence. And so then he followed a Napoleonic doctrine. It's called defeat in detail. I don't know if you watched the video. If you did, it explained it pretty well. But the idea here is if you can get your enemy to separate their forces, and then you can attack the separate bits. If you're outnumbered, say 17,000 to 52,000, and the enemy splits his 52,000 men into 3 or more forces, your whole army can outnumber any one of them. And so that's what Jackson did. He'd leave little bits of men here and there to make it look like his army was somewhere else, and then he would combine all his forces and attack a weak point in the Union lines. And he was able to do this over and over and over again and win a whole series of battles that he shouldn't have won. And part of that has to do with the Union command structure, and we'll talk about that. The Union Army was not one army, it was 3 armies. And because it was 3 armies, it didn't have a unified command. And so Jackson, who did, was able to outmaneuver his opponents. The first army to come down was under General Nathaniel Banks. You can see his arrogance right here. He's got that pilgrim-looking hat, too, which I think is funny. He was a political general from Massachusetts. He used to be Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he got his position through his political power, his political appointment. So basically what he did was, you remember, maybe you don't remember, but Patterson, I think, was the name of the general who was in charge of the Union forces in the Shenandoah during First Manassas, and he got fooled, if you recall, by Johnston and his army, and ended up not getting to the Battle of Manassas and not keeping the army of the Shenandoah in the Shenandoah Valley. And so he got fired. And when he got fired, the guy who rabble-roused the most for him to be fired was this guy Banks, who ended up taking his place. Now, he had no military experience, but he was cocky, he was aggressive, he was completely untrained, and he didn't listen to any of his well-trained officers. And so he showed up with an army of 35,000 men, but I put that in parentheses because really he functionally had about 9,000 men. What ended up happening was Lincoln took most of his men away to help protect Washington because he was afraid that when McClellan left with the army, that Washington was left somewhat undefended. Anyway, long story short, he was the first opponent of Jackson. The next guy who controlled an army was John Fremont. He had about 11,000 men in West Virginia. He was a famous guy. He was an explorer and an Indian fighter from California. He had fought in the Mexican War and then sort of settled in California and then was recalled to fight in this war. But it turns out that he was unfamiliar with the territory and he was pretty unaggressive. He was cautious with his army and therefore didn't move particularly fast or decisively. And this was the only campaign he fought in. He was reassigned after failing in this campaign. And then the third Union force was our old friend General McDowell, the guy who lost First Manassas. He was in charge of the First Corps of the Union Army, and he was moving south from D.C. to Richmond to help McClellan, and he stopped at Fredericksburg when he heard how badly Jackson was defeating the other Union armies. Lincoln sent McDowell in to finish the job against Jackson, so he was sent to the Shenandoah to finish him. But it didn't really work out in his favor. So back to our Shenandoah campaign. There were a series of battles. I'm not gonna bore you with all of the details, but Jackson was able to outmaneuver Banks, who was super cocky and arrogant, and they fought a battle at Front Royal that completely annihilated Banks's functional control of his army. The whole army retreated up to Harpers Ferry and then continued retreating into into Maryland. And that left Jackson with just 2 armies to face off against Fremont's and McDowell. Still significantly outnumbered, he was able to adjust his forces to meet Fremont and defeat him before he had to face McDowell. And then he was able to retreat down the Shenandoah Valley and essentially goad McDowell into dividing his army in half and coming down one half of the Massanutten Mountain Range uh, with half of his army, and down the other side of the Massanutten Mountain Range with another half of his army through the Fort Valley. And ultimately, Jackson was able to attack half of McDowell's army and defeat it, leaving the other half trapped on the other side of the mountain. But his army was getting tired, and he was outnumbered, and things weren't looking great for him, even though he's had all these victories. And Lee was concerned that Richmond was going to be taken by McClellan, and so Lee asked Jackson to march his army back to Richmond to help defend. And so his final stroke of genius in this campaign was that he was able to escape. There was an enormous Union army gathered to destroy him, and he was able to get out of there and sort of leave the Union looking for him in the valley when he wasn't there. And so he's able to lead a campaign of stunning victories against a numerically superior foe. Not only that, but he's able to tie up over 40,000 U.S. troops who could have been used in the siege of Richmond and maybe ended the war by capturing the southern capital. And he does all of this and leaves with his army relatively unscathed and fully functional. And that's why he's such a famous general from the war. His campaign, his Shenandoah Valley campaign, has been studied alongside the campaigns of Napoleon and the campaigns of Julius Caesar in the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and at West Point since the end of the Civil War. And so, I think that's just something you need to know. And this is going on simultaneous. This is happening at the same time that McClellan's Peninsula Campaign is going on. So think about the lecture from last week and transpose or interweave these two things in your minds. I think it's also a really important campaign because it gave the South hope. Things weren't looking great from the Southern perspective when Jackson's Valley campaign happened. The truth is that McClellan was pressuring Richmond. The South had just lost Forts Henry and Donelson to a guy named Grant out west. They were on the Mississippi, so they lost control of the northern Mississippi. A amphibious landing took New Orleans from the South, and so they had lost New Orleans. And so from the Southern perspective, things were going from bad to worse, and they were losing the war. And Jackson's campaign became this great PR thing that gave them a lot of hope and got heavily publicized. And that's part of the mystique that it has, is that everybody talked about it, and it was such an important thing for the Southern cause in a way that wasn't necessarily purely strategic or military. And so there's that. And then I think from the flip side, from the North, McClellan's campaign wasn't going anywhere. And all of their victories were way out west, which weren't really having any particular impact on the South, at least not one that they could see. And Washington was still under threat. And Lincoln thought that Jackson had a lot more men than he did because he was being so successful. And Lincoln and the North did not use their cavalry in the same way as scouts at this point in the war, so they didn't have very accurate intelligence. And so Lincoln was concerned that Jackson's army was going to attack Washington while McClellan was away. And it's one of the main reasons that McClellan ended up being recalled, was this fear that superior Southern generalship and armies would be able to threaten Washington. And so you can see the impact on the North as well. They were sort of, while the South gained hope, the North sort of lost some hope and became fearful, and their tactics shifted a bit. And so all of this is important stuff. But I think that's enough to go with today, just to sort of continue your history lesson. Remember that your paper is due on Friday. If anybody wants help with that at all, email me. We can set up a Google Meet. I'm happy to talk to you about your paper. You should have turned in a thesis statement to me today. I'm more than happy to look at those, and I will get you feedback as soon as I can. Thank you for your time and attention. Bye.